Hi, Daniela. Excited to be casing with you. I will jump right in to the case if you have a paper ready to go.
Perfect. I'm ready, Abby.
Fantastic. So our client is KLM, a global airline that operates on average 650 flights per day at about 150 airports globally. KLM has successfully completed 3 separate AI tool pilots with BCG, each focusing on different AI-based operational tools aimed at optimizing various aspects of their airline operations. The pilots have been successful, and given the outcomes of these pilots, KLM now seeks to deploy these AI solutions across its entire fleet or operations. So the questions for us today is, how should KLM approach scaling this technology to ensure a smooth and effective implementation across all departments and routes?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Abby. Very excited to start this case. So let me just recap to make sure that I got all the information. So our client is KLM, a global Dutch airline, and they asked us to understand how they can scale these 3 AI tools to optimize their operations across their entire fleet, which composes 150 airports and 650 flights. And they want to ensure that it's a smooth and effective implementation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, perfect. Before we jump into the question, I would love to have some clarifying questions so I can better understand those AI tools. Could you provide me more information of what is the goal of these 3 AI tools and what is the benefit for the client of each of those tools?
Yeah, great question. So the airline views this as primarily a cost-saving exercise. So in terms of the objective, the various AI tools enhance operational efficiencies and reduce costs. And the aim is to streamline all operational areas and provide a consistent service quality as well. But I think the primary objective is how can we save costs? And then in terms of the different tools that were deployed, so there's 3 tools. One is Pathfinder, the second is Sentry and Runway, and the third is Crew Vision. So starting with AI tool 1, Pathfinder, this is a tool that optimizes fleet and tail assignments, and it results in a 15% reduction in ferry flights, which is essentially empty flights flying to change the location of the plane. So it can fly a specific route. So it might go from Heathrow to Amsterdam because Amsterdam needs an extra plane, but the flight is empty. And it also results in a 10% increase in on-time departures. So that's tool 1. Tool 2, Sentry and Runway, is used for day-to-day operations disruption management, and it led to a 20% reduction in delay-related costs for the airline. And then tool 3, Crew Vision, balances crew rosters, staffing efficiencies, and that results in a reduction in overtime hours by about 10%.
Perfect. That's great. Let me just recap to make sure that I got all the information. So it's basically 3 tools: Pathfinder, Sentry, Runway, and Crew Vision. Tool 1 helps to reduce by 15% ferry flights and increase by 10% on-time departures. Tool 2 reduces by 20% the in-delayed costs related for the airline, and tool 3 reduces the overtime by 10%.
Perfect.
Perfect. Do you mind if I take a minute to structure? Sorry, last question. In terms of timeline, do they have any timeline that they want to finalize this project?
That's a great question. They aim to complete the deployment of the 3 softwares within about 12 months. So basically it coincides with the next start of their operational year.
Okay, perfect. I think I have all the information. Do you mind if I take a minute to structure my thoughts and share with you?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, perfect. So in order to evaluate how we can deploy and scale those 3 AI tools in a smooth and effective way for KLM, I would start evaluating 3 main things. So the first thing would be the tech implementation. The second thing would be change management plan, training, and communication plan. And then the third thing would be to create systems and operations to monitor, evaluate, and make adjustments as we implement those changes. In the first piece of tech implementation, I would think about two main things. The first would be centralized systems. Think which systems we need to do implementation centralized. And the second thing would be airport by airport. So systems that we actually need to deploy them locally on each airport, because that's going to take more time and it's going to be more logistic complexity. In terms of the change management training and also stakeholder communication plan, I would think about three main things that we need to deploy here. The first would be to do a stakeholder mapping, understand who are the project owners, who are the decision makers, who needs to be consulted and informed, and making sure that we present the project to have the buy-in of those stakeholders. The second would be in terms of like, who are the people that we actually need to train in order to deploy those systems. And then the third would make sure that we have a solid communication plan, so everyone is informed in every phase of the project. In terms of the three steps of monitoring, evaluating, and adjustment systems, I would think here about three main things that we need to keep in mind in order to do this implementation. The first would be making sure that we have success metrics and also tracking systems to track those success metrics. The second would be like governance and forums, make sure that we have audit forums in order to report those success metrics, make decisions, and also evaluating blockers so we can actually have a smooth implementation. And then the third piece would be improvement opportunities. So making sure that we have process to improve after any roadblock or changes that we actually see. So in order for us to start here, I think the piece that I would like to start is with our tech implementation. So trying to understand like what are the benefits of those tools and which tool we need to start centralized versus airport by airport. Do we have any information related to those tools?
Yeah, so we do have some information on that, which we'll get to later. But I think before we get into some of those questions, would love to just do kind of a brainstorming market sizing exercise with you. And to start with that, in preparing for the rollout, KLM wants to confirm the potential impact we might see in terms of cost, specifically for the tool Pathfinder, the first one we discussed, that is expected to increase on-time departures by 10%. And so for this tool, would love to just get your thoughts on what you think the main expense categories or buckets that an airport may have to pay for as the result of a flight delay.
Perfect. So just to recap, to make sure that I have all the information. So the goal is for us to estimate the impact of Pathfinder 2 in terms of the increase of on-time departure by 10%. And you want me to list what are some of potential costs related to flight delays?
Yeah, and that's kind of the first step here of if we list out the costs that are associated with delays, we can think about then what we might save as the result of implementing this software.
Okay, perfect. So in terms of potential costs, I see 4 potential costs here that will be very meaningful to any flight delay. The first will be definitely labor costs. So we think here about crew, pilot, and also people in the airport that are responsible for managing the flight. The second will be definitely fuel. It's a big portion of the cost of a flight. The second would be any airport fees. I know airport usually charge a fee or a penalty for any additional time that we stay on the finger. And then the fourth would be passenger compensations. We know that after a certain threshold, we need to compensate either for a meal or for any type of cost passengers on that. So those would be the main 4 costs that I would list here. Do you want me to start doing the estimation?
Yeah, that would be great. I think guidance would be, can you just estimate the average cost for each of these buckets for a 1-hour time delay? And then add them up and get the estimated costs for KLM for a 1-hour delay.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to start with labor first. So in terms of labor, I would estimate that for each flight, we would have 2 pilots, 5 crew members, and then 3 to 10 people on the ground. So adding all those things up, so we're going to have an average of like 15 people per flight. I would assume that for each person, we pay them like $50 an hour. So that's going to give us 15 times 50. It's going to give us $750 an hour. So going to the fuel cost, do we have any information on how much it's the cost of the fuel per flight?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's about one flight on average. You have to fill it up with about $50,000 or euros worth of fuel.
Okay, perfect. So I would assume, so assuming this $50,000 per flight cost, I would assume that we usually spend like 5% of this cost when the airline is actually delayed. So that would give us 5% of 50,000, 2,500 euro per hour per flight per delay. So going to the airport fees, do you have any information about what it's going to be the fee that airport charges per hour?
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, they charge you $100 an hour to be parked at the gate.
Okay, perfect. So it's going to be our estimation, $100 per hour per flight delay. And then in terms of the passengers, I'm going to assume here how much we pay per passenger per hour, and then an average amount of passengers per flight. So usually I receive around $50. So I'm going to use that as a benchmark. So $50 per hour per passengers. I would guess that the average amount of passengers per flight is 150. So multiplying those things together, these give us 7,500 per hour in passengers cost per flight delay. So I'm going to add all those things up so I can actually have all these costs here. Okay. Okay, so adding all those things up, we're going to have around 11,000 euros cost per hour per flight.
Perfect. That's correct. And so assuming that this tool is going to increase on-time flights by 10% and that 80% of KLM 650 on-time flights are delayed per day right now, what's going to be your estimate of sort of the annualized cost savings for implementing this tool?
So 80% of KLM flights are delayed or on time?
They're on time. So 20% are delayed.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so in order to calculate what would be the annual cost for all the flights, the math that I would do here, I would just multiply this percentage of flights that actually are delayed times the number of flights a day times the average delay, and then also the cost that we estimated per hour plus 365, which would be the number of days that we have. So that's the entire equation is going to give us 20%, which is the number of flights delayed, times 650, which is the number of flights that we have per day. In terms of like the average delay that we have, I'm going to assume that it's like around 45 minutes, times 11,000, which is our cost per hour, times 365. So multiplying 20% of 650, this gives us 130. 45 minutes, I'm going to use as percentage of 60 minutes. So that's going to give us 75% times 11,000 times 365. So doing all this math here, we are going to arrive to around $1 million per day times 365. So this gives us 365 million in annual costs for the delay. So now after calculating this, we need to understand what is the reduction of this cost with the increase of 10% on delays, on flight delays. Okay, so in order for me to calculate that, I'm just gonna multiply the percentage reduction on flights delay times the 365 million in cost. So we know that you shared with me that 80% of the flights are on time. So if we increase that by 10%, we are telling that 88% of the flights are actually on time. So the number of flights, the percentage of flights delay, it's gonna change from 20% to 12%. So that's an 8 percentage points decline, which in percentage translates into a 40% reductions of the flight delay. So I'm going to multiply this 40% reduction on flight delays by our annual cost of 365 million. So multiplying that by 40%, it's going to give us 150 million in cost savings. That sounds a very significant cost. So I think definitely the airline should implement this AI too, because it's a meaningful difference in their cost, a 40% reduction. I think as next steps here, we need to think how we actually implement those tools and phase out.
Yeah, that's a great next step. And going back to your framework and where you wanted to start, we do have some information on, how the tools would be implemented, whether centrally or not. And the first tool, so Pathfinder, the one that we just kind of talked about, would be integrated into a central system. And then the other two tools, Sentry and Runway and Crew Vision, would need to be integrated airport by airport across KLM's approximately 150 service locations. And so a key question for the rollout is how to deploy these three tools. Should they all be rolled out at once, or should there be some other logical sequence? And sort of would love to get your thoughts on how KLM should think about making this rollout decision.
Perfect. So just to recap, the first two, which pathway should be implemented centrally, the second one, the second and the third, airport by airport. And then the client wants to understand how we would deploy these tools phase by phase. Let me just get a minute to structure my thoughts, and then I'll let you know. Okay, perfect. In order to think about how we actually implement that and phase out, I would take into account three main things. So the first thing would be interdependencies and complexity of implementing these tools. And here I'm saying basically, for sure, we need to assess if there is any requirement or dependencies on each of these tools. So we need to know which one we start first in order for the second one to have the dependencies ready. The second piece in terms of complexities, we need to think about, for example, a central tool. For sure, it's less complex in terms of logistics than actually an airport by airport. So maybe one hypothesis here, we start with the centralized tool, and then we go with the second and the third in parallel. So we actually can start with a less complex, and then go to these other more challenge tools. I think one thing for us to keep in mind is that, as you mentioned, we need to have a 12 months timeline. So we need to understand if those things would actually lead us to a 12 months timeline. So the second thing that I think we need to keep in mind and assess as criteria in order to develop a implementation phase by phase would be in terms of team capacity. Do we actually have the capacity to do those things in parallel, or we actually need to think about each one step by step? And then the third piece that I would think here, it's more of like the benefits and the strategic prioritization. So we saw that tool one actually can lead us with 150 million in cost savings. So assuming that's like the most impactful one, we actually should start with the pathway tools before, because the client actually see the benefits right away and also starts to have those cost savings early as possible. So my recommendation here would definitely, assuming that tool one is actually the one that brings the biggest benefit, would be to start with the pathway tools, which centralize, less complex, and the client can start seeing the benefits early on, and then go to the airport by airport, so tools 2 and 3 in parallel, so we can actually complete these in the 12 months timelines and leave the ones that are more challenged and has higher logistics complexity afterwards. I think for sure, in order for us to implement that, we need to evaluate some of the potential risks.
Yeah, that's a really great, proposed deployment plan, as well as a great next step. And, going off of that, AI tools have been coming under fire by governments, including the EU governments that oversee KLM, a Dutch airline. And so we'd love to get your thoughts on some of the key risks of deploying these tools and how KLM could think about mitigating some of these risks.
Perfect. So just to recap, you want me to understand what are some of the key risks related to compliance and also regulation on implementing AI tools. Okay, so I think some of the key risks that I would think here is, one, the first, as you mentioned, compliance. So we have a lot of regulation coming from European Union. So they have the DMA, which the Digital Market Act. So we need to think about those data restrictions. So I think one thing to mitigate that I would think is to maybe having a compliance team or a compliance expert together with our implementation team, so he can actually assess if there is any risks there and also propose solutions so we can address those risks. So the second thing that I would think about when we think about AI implementations is definitely security risks. So we know that AI usually are implemented on cloud, and we have a lot of sensitive data and a high volume of sensitive data on the cloud. So we need to think about here potential cybersecurity systems and also processes that we need to put in place in order to mitigate any potential data leakage, especially from sensitive data. So a couple of ideas would be to create systems and routines that actually assess if there's any data leakage, so we actually can address right away. The third thing that I would think is more about like the operational complexity, not only AI systems, but systems in general. Every time that you're doing integrations, there is always a risk of those things not working out. So I think one of the potential mitigation here would be for us to first start with a test environment before we actually roll out of those changes, so we can assess what are some of the things that didn't go well on the test environment that actually we can address before going to a production environment and rolling out all of the changes. So that would be some of the risks and mitigations that I would think here.
All great risks. Okay, so we're preparing for a final meeting with the client sponsor. That's the COO of KLM, and would love to get your thoughts on how you would summarize our current recommendation to them.
Perfect. Let me just get a minute to structure my thoughts here, and then I let you know. Okay, my recommendation for our client would be to first start with a phased out, carefully and managed implementation, starting with the implementation of 2.1, which would be Pathfinder, and then followed by a gradually implementation of the 2 second systems, so system 2 and also system 3. These would help us to first capture the benefits. Second, start with the systems that have a high complexity in the second phase. And because they are going to be in parallel, we have low disruptions of the airport activity. As next steps, I think, as I mentioned, we need to think about a change management plan, a training for the employees, and also a communication plan for stakeholders. And as potential risks that we need to address with our mitigation plan, it's for sure compliance risks that we're seeing, data privacy, potential risks, and also any routines and test environments that we need to implement in order to make sure that we mitigate our operational risks.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Daniela. That's the case. It was great casing with you.
Hey everyone, it's Kenton Kavesky here, the founder of Rocketblocks. Thank you so much for watching this mock interview video. I hope you found it informative and helpful as you are getting ready to prepare for your own interviews and hopefully landing that job offer you are excited about. We have a ton of great content on the Rocketblocks channel coming out on a weekly basis, mock interviews, mini lessons, and chats with our Rocketblocks experts. So if you haven't subscribed yet already, please do so. There is a big red button below. And if you hit that, you'll get all of our content as soon as it comes out. Thanks for watching and have a great day.